Hi, everyone. Welcome to Waste 360's Nothing Wasted podcast. On every episode, we invite the most interesting people in waste, recycling, and organics to sit down with us and chat candidly about their thoughts, their work, this unique industry, and so much more. So thanks for listening and enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. This is Liz Bothwell from Waste 360 with Matt Karmel. He's an attorney with Riker, Danzig Environmental Law. Welcome back, Matt, and thanks for being on the show again.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be back.
And Matt, I know you and I have spoken before on this podcast, but for those who don't know you, could you please remind us a bit about your background and what ignited your interest in sustainability?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, I'm an environmental attorney, which means that I handle all different types of matters that relate to the environment, whether that's site remediation, cleanup of contaminated brownfields, or as I've been doing a lot more recently, focusing on solid waste and recycling and matters relating to sustainability. So my interest in that has been piqued for a long time and has, significantly included organics recycling. New Jersey for many years has been expanding its focus on food waste recycling and organics recycling. And that really opened a door that I saw to expand my practice, expand what I'm focusing on, help to build that industry in New Jersey. And so I, took that opportunity, have been working with industry groups and others to try to get that off the ground. And, at the same time, keeping my eye on all other matters relating to sustainability in New Jersey, including renewable energy, and also, the recent environmental justice law that I know we're going to talk a lot about today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. And yes, I'd like to dive right into that. Like you said, you're a Jersey guy, and this is landmark environmental justice law. So I'd love to dig into that. Can you just tell us more about it and break down what it means?
Absolutely. So, I'm sure many people have heard about it. It's being lauded as, the toughest in the nation as from an environmental justice perspective. And but really, what does that mean? So first, let's talk about environmental justice. The concept of environmental justice, according to the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, is ensuring the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And in other words, there tends to be around urban communities, lots of large facilities that have environmental impact. And there's often the feeling that they get cited in those communities and that those communities face a disproportionate impact, that they have more environmental burdens and fewer environmental benefits than those in other communities. And so in order to address this, many states have taken different approaches. And New Jersey's approach in this new law, which has just been passed and is being, the process of gearing up for implementation is going on. This new law aims to address that by incorporating environmental justice considerations into the permitting process, so that when a facility is going to expand or site in a specific area, it will need certain permits. And as part of that process, we'll have to take a look at what are the environmental burdens on that community from that project, and is there a disproportionate impact on that community as a result of the facility when you compare it to another community within the state. That's a whole lot, so we can certainly take a little bit of time to unpack that.
That would be great.
So the touchstone of the law is the preparation and submission of an environmental justice impact statement. And this is a report that evaluates the impact from a facility and then determines whether there's a disproportionate impact from that facility on its host community as compared against a third community, another community. So, for instance, Camden, New Jersey has some communities that are considered overburdened communities, and we'll get into what the definition of overburdened community is in a minute. But so if a facility that requires a covered permit is going to be sited in Camden, New Jersey, in one of these communities, the report would have to look at the impacts from the facility, the impacts within the community itself, and then it would have to sum those impacts and compare it to another community outside of Camden and say, okay, is there a disproportionate impact? Is this community within Camden bearing more environmental harms than other communities outside of the state, outside of that area? And that's a complicated thing, but something that we'll have to figure out how to do. And when I say we need to figure out how to do it, the law creates a really strong framework. It tells us what we have to do, and it tells us what the DEP's authority is in reviewing the environmental justice impact statement. But it doesn't fill in all the details. And that is really where the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection is going to be focusing in the next couple months. And they've already started to do so by engaging stakeholders and having stakeholder meetings to explore the key concepts of the legislation.
Got it. And then, you mentioned defining overburdened communities. I mean, and it sounds like New Jersey might be the first one to actually compare existing communities to others. Now, when you say that, like, for example, when you mentioned Camden, would it be other communities within New Jersey, or will it look at other states as well?
So an overburdened community is defined in the legislation. So in order for the legislation to apply, in order for the requirement to prepare an environmental justice impact statement to apply, the facility is going to need to be located in an overburdened community. It's going to need to be a covered facility, and it's going to need to be applying for a specified permit. So taking overburdened community first. Overburdened community is not actually defined in the legislation based on the impact on the community. So it's instead defined based on certain socioeconomic indicators, socioeconomic demographics within those communities. So, for instance, what's the percentage of English-speaking people? What's the percentage of certain minorities? What's the percentage of low-income households? If any of those socioeconomic indicators is triggered above the threshold for it, then that's considered an overburdened community. It is more helpful a little bit sometimes to think about it as a potentially overburdened community or an environmental justice community, an area where the demographics suggest that we may have an environmental justice issue. And according to, reports, the definition of overburdened communities could apply to more than 300 municipalities and 4 million residents in New Jersey. So it's a significant portion of the state. And there are some, preliminary maps out that have been prepared, which show some of the locations of these overburdened communities within the state.
Wow, that is a huge number. Now, Matt, are they using census data or the reports you're referring to? How are they determining?
They're using census data, exactly. They're using census data, and the communities are actually defined by census tract. So so the communities are circumscribed by the census.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay.
And the facilities that are included, the covered facilities, are several different types of waste management and recycling operations, as well as facilities with what's called a major source air permit, a Title V permit, which applies to facilities with significant air emission. And then the permits that are covered are a wide range. There's some specificity to be worked out about what types of permits, but it's really anything and everything. It's very broad, but it is individual permits, meaning permits that are tailored to the facility, or at least it appears this way based on the legislation, and not general permits, which are permits that can be sort of more taken off the shelf. And that's a normal distinction in permits, where individual permits have more application requirements, are more closely tailored, and general permits are more, procedurally, administratively streamlined. And so it will apply to a very wide range of individual permits.
Got it. Okay. Now, I'm in Connecticut, so I heard that Connecticut's law in this respect is procedural, where New Jersey's takes it a step further. Can you talk about the difference between that?
Absolutely. As you mentioned, New Jersey takes it a step further. There is a substantive component because at the conclusion of the environmental justice impact statement, depending on what the context is, the DEP has certain authority. So for a new permit, for a permit for a new facility, if the facility would cause or contribute to an adverse cumulative environmental or public health stressors in the overburdened community, in other words, if it would cause or contribute to a cumulative negative impact on that community that is higher than the impact borne by other communities within the state, the DEP shall deny the permit. That's the first part. There is a compelling interest exception, which we can talk about separately, which has some specific nuances. But, to restate the general rule, for new permits, for new facilities, if there is a negative cumulative impact or a disproportionate impact from the facility, the DEP is to deny the permit, period. And then we get into whether there is a compelling public interest. Now, there are, I would say, at least 3 nuances in what I just said. The first is, how do you determine what the impact of a facility is? And that's the first nuance that really needs to be fleshed out. And that's the key of the environmental justice impact statement, the report that I was talking about earlier. But what gets included in the first instance? Certainly, air emissions get included, and that's included in the definition of environmental or public health stressor, which is the touchstone of it, and other traditional sources of discrete pollution, like water pollution or things like that, the kind of thing that comes out of a pipe or a stack that you'd expect. But the definition of environmental or public health stressor also includes conditions that may cause potential public health impacts, such as asthma, cancer, elevated blood levels, etc. And so what this is going to include, that is I would say, a flexible definition that is going to allow the state to broadly define what is an environmental or public health stressor. And this is important because these are the things that are going to be considered when we're deciding what the impact of a facility is. And so, we're talking about, as I said, the traditional sources of pollution that come out of a stack or a pipe. And then we're also talking about other things. For instance, in stakeholder meetings, the state has questioned age of housing. If we have old housing in the area, if we have lead in water lines in the area, if there's lack of access to healthy food, if there's lack of access to green space, if there's traffic impact, those things are likely, I would say, to be considered in environmental or public health stressors. So you both have, these more attenuated negative effects and the absence of positive effects. So, if you were to build a power plant in an area and therefore, disrupt a green space, if the construction of a power plant were to remove a portion of a park or something like that, that would be considered because we're losing some green space. Now, this is going to be a difficult thing, I think, for the state to define because they're going to have to ground it in science of, okay, how exactly does this impact, even if it's lack of green space, contribute to a public health impact like asthma, cancer, elevated blood lead levels, etc. How do we tie that together? I'm expecting them to do it broadly, but so this is the first nuance of this is how do we define that? And then we're attempting to come up with a holistic evaluation. So how do we compare different impacts? How do we compare air impacts to noise impacts? How do we compare air impacts to green space? How do we compare this to come up with the holistic determination that this law is looking for? And I'll pause there because, as I noted, we're just into the first nuance of that. There are other significant nuances to discuss.
Wow, that's a big challenge.
Yeah, it's going to be difficult. The state knows that it's going to be difficult, and this is one of the reasons that I think we're in. I mean, it was an incredible victory to get this law passed for the champions of environmental justice. It has been pending in some form before New Jersey's legislature for more than a decade. So to get it now is a tremendous victory. But it's sort of, we've crested the first hill and the higher hill is in the distance. And we have to cross that hill and get something that is defensible and works as a balance for the environmental groups and industry in New Jersey, because we need industry, but we need to make sure that it is developed sustainably and that it is, it fits within the communities where it's located. So that is also what this balance is showing. We have a lot of different stakeholders that are going to be at the table during these discussions. And so it's going to be a difficult process and one the state is going to manage carefully.
Yes, they definitely will need to manage this carefully, and all of the stakeholders need to be there. I mean, this is, like we talked about, it's landmark, it's unprecedented. So without all of them at the table, this will not be successful. So wow, it's quite a hurdle, but worthy of obviously trying and doing. So I'm going to be so curious to watch this. Now, Matt, you mentioned two other nuances. Can you get into those?
Yeah. So the others I think are a little narrower. That first one was quite meaty, but one is I was mentioning that there's a disproportionate impact. That we're focusing on disproportionate impact. So we need to compare the environmental justice community, the overburdened community, and the impact on it by the facility that we're focusing on against another community within the state. But the legislation doesn't tell us what the comparison should be. It says that we compare to another community within the state, county, or other geographic unit of analysis. So we could compare, a tiny community to a larger community, or a large community to a tiny community. That's where we're getting in. And this is going to be something that is interesting as to whether the state circumscribes it or leaves it flexible as to, when they do what. And it may be driven by what is the primary impact. If, for instance, if air is the primary impact from a facility, air emissions impact a larger area than noise impact. So it would make sense to have a larger area of comparison. And so that's that nuance, is defining what is the comparison community and how big is it. And then the other one that I was mentioning is the compelling interest exception. So as I noted, the DP has to deny a new permit if there is a disproportionate impact, unless there's a compelling public interest. Now, compelling public interest language is not, is not unusual. But what is specific about this is that the compelling public interest must be in the host community, the overburdened community. So again, let's take the Camden example. If we're going to be building a facility in Camden and we are going to be using the compelling public interest exception, the interest for that facility needs to be in Camden. So if it's a power plant that is serving Philadelphia, Philadelphia may have an interest in this power plant, but unless the community of Camden does as well, it's not going to satisfy the compelling public interest exception.
Gotcha. Makes sense.
It's very important because it's co-locating the costs and benefits of a facility.
Now, is there worry that there could be some greenwashing involved? I mean, will that be monitored? For example, I know a lot of brands and companies get a lot of slack for, hey, buy this and we'll plant some trees, right? So, I mean, is there any boundaries or expectations around what they need to do to have a positive impact within a community? Is that defined anywhere yet?
it's not yet. And I think that this is actually an open issue as to whether you can offset impact. Let's say it's a facility with significant air impacts, but the developers of the facility say, okay, I am going to go and buy this other piece of property that is, abandoned and create a park with trees, et cetera, and that's going to offset my impacts. And, that may fit within what you were describing. And I think that we just don't know yet whether that's going to be permissible, and that has been an issue that's been discussed in the existing stakeholder meetings, though, and it's an open issue.
Gotcha.
As to more generally, the state is going to be reviewing the environmental justice impact statements. So, the applicant, the facilities, will have some flexibility to draft the impact statements to view their project in the best light. And frankly, they should try to take advantage of that, to deeply examine and contextualize their impacts and their benefits. But the state will be the ultimate arbiter of what is the impact of a facility.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds like good advice to the sector and to facilities. Is there anything else you would say to the waste sector to help them prepare for this implementation?
Absolutely. So I mean, the first is we already have an idea of where the overburdened communities are. Facilities need to look at that list, see whether they're in the pre-planning phases or where they match up where they are in the planning phase, and look at where they're locating their facilities, just to know whether they're going to be subject to this. If they are likely to be subject, and really regardless of whether they're going to be subject to this, they should start making some kind of public outreach plan, because this law isn't in effect yet. It doesn't actually go into effect with its substantive portions until the regulations are adopted that tell us how to do all these things we've been talking about. But so organizations should start looking at what their community outreach plan is, should start building those grassroots connections, those grassroots relationships at the local level to get community buy-in to the extent that that's possible. And also should really take a look at the design of their facilities and what their impacts are, and see, what narratives and context they can provide for their facility. Because at these early planning stages is when it's really important to have that approach, because you don't want to get very far down the line and realize that you need to change something significantly, or realize that you don't have local support. It's really to really plan ahead and look at where you are from both, the statutory perspective, also the relationship perspective, and then actually the environmental impact perspective.
That's good advice. Now, Matt, will this impact existing facilities at all, or this is just new facilities moving forward?
So it impacts, and this was a very controversial portion of the legislation. It impacts existing facilities in two ways. The first is expansions of facilities are subject, generally. So if you're a covered facility and you're expanding, then you're subject if you're applying for one of the covered permits. The other way that existing facilities will be subject is existing facilities with major source permits, those air permits that I was referencing earlier, Title V permits. Facilities are subject upon the renewal of that permit. And so whether they expand or not, those facilities are subject. But the important thing to note for existing facilities is that the DEP it is not permitted, the state is not permitted to outright deny the permit, but they are permitted to apply conditions to the permit in the event that there's a disproportionate impact. So we go through the same analysis we talked about before. What is the impact on the community? How do we compare it to another community to determine the disproportionate impact? But what we get to at the end is what conditions should be applied, if any. And there's no ability for the state to deny a permit just based on for that renewal.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, this is a lot to digest. I mean, are other states watching and waiting and seeing how this all goes?
Absolutely. I mean, this is being considered a national model by a lot of people, or a potential national model. And so, this is, I think the country is watching, and as we try to answer these questions and create the balance between industry and environment, and industry and environmental justice, that will allow us, to have a thriving state. And yeah, I mean, I think maybe states like Connecticut would like to convert theirs from a procedural to a substantive at some point. But I think it's also something that is being considered, at the national level, and something that the EPA has been considering. So I think that it's definitely something that's being watched at that level.
Sure. And so moving forward, I know you said we have to wait until a lot of this is already in place. How long do you think this is going to take, short term and long term? What's ahead?
So it's very hard to estimate how long a regulatory process is going to take usually. And this is, a specific case given all of the issues that we've outlined, and we've probably only covered half of them, to be slightly facetious. So, I would expect that, although this is a significant priority for the state, so it is being fast-tracked, but that still means that we'd be extremely lucky to see proposed regulations in 6 months, I would say. And we're probably looking at a year before we see proposed regulations. Maybe we can do it faster. Maybe it'll take longer. It'll really depend on how the stakeholder meetings go, which the second stakeholder meeting is scheduled for later this month, and we'll cover a specific issue. So we are getting into the nitty-gritty of in the stakeholder meetings, and really focusing on trying to resolve specific issues. The sort of wild card question is, how will industry and environmental groups view the regulations when they're proposed? Because, we're going to reach a compromise of some instance. You have so many diverse stakeholders at the table. The old adage in compromises is the best compromise is when nobody's happy. But how unhappy are people going to be? And when we finally do get regulations, are we going to see challenges to those regulations on certain grounds? And that is going to be an interesting question, because that could significantly extend the period in which we're waiting for this thing to be fully actual.
Now, are those groups in these stakeholder meetings, Matt?
I would say likely yes. I mean, the stakeholder meetings are open to anyone who is interested in participating, and the membership has been quite broad and has included industry and environmental groups. So I mean, I would think that I would also expect the state to ensure that everyone's at the table and that it's considering all of those perspectives. And they have said as much in the stakeholder meetings. That's their goal. So yes, they are very inclusive stakeholder meetings. But that still doesn't guarantee that at the end of the day everyone will be happy.
Oh, absolutely. And to your point, most probably will not. Wow, this is going to be very interesting to watch. I mean, do you think a Biden administration with, I guess that's a double question, right? Like how it will impact this exact legislation, and then do you think it will help with other environmental legislation down the road?
So I think that the Biden administration provides some support from this. I mean, it certainly shows that the nation is interested in these kinds of things. The way that the election has resulted. So this is a trend. So I think that the Biden administration bodes for an expansion of this policy outside of New Jersey. I certainly think this is something that several pundits are expecting the Biden administration to pick up at some level or another. So it will be very interesting to see how that plays out, whether it's made a significant touchstone of his administration or even his first 100 days. I haven't heard definitively yet, but I also wouldn't be surprised.
Sure. Okay. But again, something to watch. I mean, the next year will be very telling.
It really will. And just to circle back to some of the things, this is going to be a landscape change for New Jersey because of the number of permits and applications that it's going to impact. so we're going to have, even after it's implemented, a little bit of a ramp-up period of time where we're figuring out how to do it, and also, amassing data, because having to do all the kinds of comparisons that I talked about initially, I don't know that we have good enough data yet on what the impacts. I mean, I'd be very surprised if we did on all of the impacts on certain communities, and so we're going to be learning a lot more about the distribution of environmental impacts within the state, and this question of what is the impact in one community versus another is going to be asked over and over and over again. And so we will learn new things as this keeps going as well about that process and about, how we site and develop facilities.
Yes, that's so true. And then, Matt, I wanted to ask you about food waste as well, but is there anything else you want to share about this particular topic before we move on? Because I know it's pretty meaty.
No, let's. So I'll give this segue, which is, so I did mention at the outset that a lot of waste management and recycling facilities are going to be subject to this law potentially. But it's worth noting, given our transition, that recycling facilities are specifically called out as having a higher threshold. So meaning it's only going to apply to larger recycling facilities. And the cutoff is 100 tons of recyclable material a day. So some recognition in the law of the environmental benefits of recycling is already baked in, and this has been something that has been, important to smaller scale food waste recycling operators who are trying to get off the ground in New Jersey as a result of all of the work that's been done surrounding the commercial organics recycling mandate, which is the law that was passed last April, which requires large food waste generators in New Jersey to recycle their food waste, and becomes effective in October of 2021.
Okay, I knew it was coming. Okay, interesting. Is there, what type of headway is being made, with this around the battle of food waste? And because I know there were a lot of issues with infrastructure changes having to be made, and just a lot of plans that needed to be laid out in order for this to do well.
Yes, so we're seeing the beginnings of headway, but we definitely need to see more. So I mentioned that October 2021 is the effective date for the organics recycling mandate. Before that happens, we need regulations to be drafted and proposed and adopted that tell businesses and operators how this law is going to be implemented. We haven't started the stakeholder process on those regulations, which gives me a little bit of concern that the mandate may be pushed a little bit or something like that. But I'm hopeful that it won't. But we have started seeing other movement, and we know that the state is focused on this. They have had some hearings lately about changing some of their regulations to accommodate small-scale food waste operators. And perhaps that is a precursor to the larger food waste recycling regulations that I was just speaking of. But I think that I'm hoping that later this year, maybe quite soon, we'll see major stakeholder meetings focused on the commercial organics recycling mandate.
Okay, that would be great. You would hate for that to get lost in the shuffle of this bigger law.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of the drawbacks of having so much going on in New Jersey from a renewable energy perspective, with all of the offshore wind focus, and also New Jersey is having a very expansive look at climate change and how climate change impacts its regulations, and how the regulations should be adopted to protect against climate threats and environmental justice. We're doing a lot at once, and that requires a lot of resources sometimes. And the state has limited resources, as do we all. So it's just, it's nice that we're trying to do all these different things. As you said, it is sad when things get lost a little bit, lost in the shuffle. But I have some hope that all of the things will keep moving forward. Especially because I think industry is responding to the commercial organics recycling mandate, at different levels, and industry is coming to New Jersey in different ways, I think, to site infrastructure and we're seeing this infrastructure expand. It takes a while for infrastructure to expand. There's a long lead time, but we're seeing some of the indicators of early infrastructure expansion, and that's a great thing for this, because the commercial organics recycling mandate, in part, is intended as an incentive for industry, intended to let industry know, one, New Jersey cares about organics recycling and is going to make it a priority, and two, that if you build a facility in a certain space, that the generators in your area, the large food waste generators, will have a requirement to send their waste to you, as long as you're financially competitive with traditional disposal.
Absolutely. Well, that's good. I'm glad to see that that's happening on the industry side. So, Matt, not that we haven't discussed enough, but is there anything else on the horizon for New Jersey around environmental issues that you see?
So we discussed a lot of interesting things. I brought up a minute ago the climate change initiative, the offshore wind initiatives, all of those different things. The only thing I think that I haven't mentioned, at least, is the last major thing that New Jersey is trying to do in 2021, which is adult use marijuana, and that will have an impact on the solid waste and recycling industry in New Jersey, as it's expected to have an impact on lots of industries. How are cannabis operations going to deal with their solid waste, and are they going to process it in an environmentally responsible way, using recycling infrastructure, using composting infrastructure, and what are the rules and regulations they're going to grow up around that? So that's something that we're also tracking through 2021. So specifically in the cannabis industry, we've represented applicants for cannabis licenses in New Jersey and supported them in defining the environmental impact and the waste management practices within their application, because it's such a competitive scoring. So that's another reason that it's going to be so interesting to see how these pieces work out, because the applicants are going, the licenses that are granted are going to be limited, and organizations are going to be incentivized, therefore, to put their best environmental foot forward when it comes to a resource use and waste management perspective. Because I am an environment nerd, just a nerd about it, it's great to have that as part of the program, because each change that we make in society has such a significant environmental impact, and to expand this industry as much as it will change electric usage, water usage, all of these things. And to have it part of the application process, to have entities required to focus on what their footprint is just a really exciting thing for someone who's who believes in sustainability in the way I do.
Oh, of course. My goodness. And just see how this is all going to transpire. My goodness.
Yeah, so it'll be an exciting year for New Jersey. We'll see how much of it we can actually get done in 2021. But I'm excited to be along for the ride.
Good. Well, it's worth watching and listening to, and it's exciting too, because, well, I told you I grew up in New Jersey, so it has a fond place in my heart, and it's exciting to see an East Coast state be so progressive on some of these issues.
Yeah, on food waste, we were probably eighth in line. I forget what the exact number was, but so I'm quite excited to reestablish our preeminence in the environmental field by getting out by establishing such a tough and such an aggressive environmental justice law.
Oh, absolutely. Interesting. Yes. Oh my goodness. And how about your work with the New Jersey Composting Council? How's that going?
It's going really well. This is the Composting Council is a couple of years old now. We have a diverse group of industry within it that are working to provide input on policy and input, on education throughout the state. And so it's really, a really great group of people that I cannot say enough good things about, who are really trying to carry the burden of this really, it's in New Jersey a slightly fledgling industry with just a handful, more than a handful, but just a small number of people really pushing this forward. So it's a tremendous opportunity, but also something that we owe a great debt of gratitude to the pioneers.
Absolutely, and the composters that I've met, they've been some of the most passionate people in the environmental space. So kudos to them.
Yeah, and one of the great things is we are seeing expanded municipal interest in composting and food waste recycling operations. Middlesex County has expressed interest, and then you also have very large, entities, municipalities in North Jersey that have food waste collection, programs and are talking about expanding those programs. So we're seeing it across the board, and I credit a lot of that to the Composting Council.
Oh, that's great! Awesome work.
It's fun work. This is something I'm incredibly passionate about. I'm honored to be an environmental attorney and to be able to support businesses and individuals that are engaged in this, to chart a future that is sustainable and just. It's something that I'm very pleased to be a part of.
Oh, that's awesome. And then before I let you go, I'd really love to know what your idea of balance would be in terms of all of this environmental justice legislation. What would that look like around industry, communities, people?
First, I think the important thing is that it requires, as the underlying concept is, it requires that everyone have a seat at the table. We have to ensure that all voices are heard. That's a prerequisite to any balance. And then, I think almost it's up to the people at the table to determine what balance looks like for a specific community. Some communities may prioritize economic factors over environmental factors, and some may prioritize environmental over economic factors. And some may say that that's not really a comparison, that we don't want to compare apples to oranges. We want to have good economy and good environment. And so I think, for me to chart it from here is not something I can do, but to say that it has to be based on the voices in that community is something that I think is certainly a truism.
Oh, that sounds great. Well, I want to thank you for being on again. This has been so enlightening, and I really look forward to watching this. And you have to come back on as this begins to be implemented and what it looks like and the reality of it.
I would love to.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you for your time today. Like I said, it's super enlightening, and I can't wait to watch and see what else happens. Well, thanks again, Matt.
This has been great. I so appreciate your opportunity. So tremendously appreciate the opportunity. It's always so nice to talk with you.
Oh, you too. And Happy New Year, and I can't wait to connect with you again soon.
Yes, that would be great. Happy New Year. We'll talk again soon.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. Bye.